Nebergall, I originally gave this talk to, sorry? Oh, very good. I originally gave this talk to the 100-Year Starship Symposium, so it's going to look not terribly Martian, but they were basically two talks I gave, and I gave the other one here last year. The other one was on modular space settlements and creating economic models to make that work. This is sort of okay, you live there, now what? How do you begin with the end in mind? So, let's see. There we go. So the main difference between life on Earth is we're used to it is we have a large population, large knowledge base, large industrial base, a diversity of raw materials, but we have a limited quantity because, as they are fond of saying at the L5 Society back in the day, 90% of the resources available to the human race are not on Earth. So with space settlement, you have a very limited population, you have a very limited industrial base, you have a slightly less diverse raw material stream because there obviously is nothing created by life. There's no limestone created by phytoplankton. There's nothing like that there. So that is not part of, there's no oil. There's nothing that's in that part of the stream. But you have a pretty much unlimited quantity of raw materials. Now, the other thing you'll note here is your knowledge base does not change. Because knowledge is not limited by material. So what we were getting at with the whole Starship thing is that your economic model gets shifts as you go from Earth to basically inside the ice belt. In other words, from the asteroid belt in. You have ample solar power. You have travel times measured in months. You have communications measured in minutes. It's going to be a problem this whole time, isn't it? Once you get past that point, you need to switch to at least fission power. You have metal becomes more scarce, but volatiles become more abundant. Travel times are measured in years, communication in tens of minutes. Once you get out to the Oort cloud or to a starship, you pretty much need fusion or better, something more exotic. Metals will presumably be more scarce. Travel times in decades, and communication, once you get past 1 light year, of course, is measured in years. So if you were to build a starship, and like I said, this was originally for the Starship Symposium, you have a settled solar system, but you have a shock point where you're going into, you have to take a culture and reduce it to the point where there is no raw material coming into the system and there is very little information coming into the system. You're locking it there for roughly 2 generations on a 50-year mission plan, and then suddenly you've got unlimited resources, but you don't have a lot of material capability in terms of factories and so forth. So your culture has to survive these 2 shock points. You have the stress of going into the soda straw and then the stress of coming back out of the soda straw. But if you think of that in terms of the space settlement architecture, presumably you're going to be in the Oort cloud before you're building a starship. Presumably you're going to be on Mars before you're in the Oort cloud. So you actually have that thing. It isn't a single shock wave of going from Earth to a starship. It's a series of concentric, like a stepped funnel. And then on the other side, there'll be another stepped funnel as you increase your industrial capacity. So our USS Strawman, as I call it, because it's a Strawman design, 50-year flight time, 100 crew at departure, 250 settlers at arrival. Sponsor would presumably be an asteroid mining company because they'd be the only one with the trillions in material to do this. Your mission is to explore, settle, communicate, mine asteroids to repair and refuel your ship, settle the asteroids and then the planets, and then eventually build your ultimate goal would be within 100 years build your own next generation starship. And then we're assuming there'd be roughly a 10-year construction time. So this is a rough thing of the demographics. You would have a bit of you would have a certain amount of ethnic diversity for the same reason, not for any kind of cultural or multicultural reason, but for the same reason that it was a really bad idea to take only 4 potato plants of the very same species to Ireland from Peru when there were about 300 to choose from, because when the potato famine hit, the blight basically wiped out the entire structure. So if you have a lot more genetic diversity in the initial sample, then you have more to work with going forward. And then I gave an age range and so forth. I also wanted to have a little bit of of age diversity because you don't want the entire first generation all dying off at once. It would be a little bit like it would be roughly as destructive to the culture as the Black Plague was when you suddenly lost, a double-digit percentage of your population in Europe. So education and skills. Needless to say, you have to be able to maintain the vehicle, and then once you get there, you have to be able to exploit the new resources. So you have to have something that is, you have to understand everything about the starship, in this case, or in the case of the space settlement, or in the case of Mars One, you have to know everything and how it works. That's fundamentally what you need to know. From there, you can build onto other things. You need to be very adaptive to settle in new situations. You need to be able to develop beyond your current technologies. So you need to know not just how to run a copier, but how to make a copier from scratch, and all the technologies that went into making a copier from whatever tech level you start with. And then soft skills of human interaction and so forth. And then the basic core life of how do you do housework and gardening and so forth. So the risk and opportunity here, we want to avoid a blind faith in technology. I mean, there's been an awful lot of science fiction stories about the colonial starship that goes out and everybody suddenly believes the starship is the universe. I mean, that's been a routine theme in science fiction. We want to avoid just assuming that what is there is everything there is. So we want to avoid investing too much in the technology that they start with, because even though it's not going to change much for 50 years while they're stuck in that environment, there is going to be a need to just not assume that that's all there is. We have the soft skills of avoiding irrational decisions by leadership, because if you only have 300 people, it's a lot easier to march 300 people off a cliff in some economic or whatever term and goes, hey, let's go do this, and suddenly, it turns out to be a bad decision. And then we also want to avoid dependency on a single group for all core life needs. If there's only 5 farmers in a population of 250 people, and those 5 farmers have an industrial accident, you don't want the population to starve. You want all the core skills of being able to eat and repair and so forth distributed across the entire population. So one model that is out there now is called, and it's been around there for thousands of years, or 2,000 years, is called the trivium and the quadrivium. This is starting to make kind of this was popular. The trivium originally started in ancient Greece, and then the quadrivium sort of became the university model back when universities were first invented in the medieval era. They've been circling back to this in some very advanced schools because they realize that we've been so busy teaching what to think, we haven't taught how to think and how to break down problems. So grammar is the mechanics of language and symbols. Logic and dialectic is the mechanics of thought and knowledge. And rhetoric is how to use language to instruct or to persuade. Unfortunately, we've got too many people who, they hear a politician say something and then they just take it as gospel. There is not enough critical thought in populations. The quadrivium, this is broken down into its, like I said, its core medieval concepts. Arithmetic is numbers, geometry is numbers in space, music is numbers in time, and astronomy is numbers in space, in time and space. And if you think about it, that's essentially what those things break down to at their atomic level. Now, do we really need music to run a starship? To a degree, yes. But even if, let's take somebody like me who cannot play an instrument to save their life, and as you can probably tell by my voice, my singing style leaves much to be desired. There is still something to be said for knowing how resonance works. Because if you don't know how resonance works, your engines are going to fall apart in a very short period of time. There's a lot to be said for just knowing the basic mechanics of these things and knowing them at a very intellectual atomic level, at the smallest Lego you can get, and knowing how all those things fit together. So another issue is, you teach people a lot of academic stuff, and the question every teacher dreads is this going to be on the final, or more accurately, am I ever going to use this? I mean, I've even seen a T-shirt recently that says, another whole week and I have not used algebra. If you take those same people and you say, okay, this morning we're going to study geometry. This afternoon we're going to go teach you how to make clothing, or some other basic skills. Then we're going to learn about genetics, and then we're going to go into the garden. If you immediately reinforce that, that actually comes out of a little bit of background I have in corporate training. It's called just-in-time training. You teach people what they need to know when they need to know it. Because a lot of times it's like, if I teach you this now, and then you go back to work for 2 weeks, you've forgotten everything 2 weeks later when you need to know what the heck you're supposed to be doing. Because as one of my coworkers loved to say, I've slept since then. If you have a system like this where you teach the basics, and this goes back to that thing of teach the basic skills of farming and so forth, all the way across the broad definition of the culture. So from a technology standpoint, we have that element of needing to know how to repair things, repair and create. Liberal arts is teaching you the basics of how things work. Like I said, music theory has something to do with resonance physics. Practicum would be, okay, now that you've learned these things now, how to apply them. Fractions obviously are critical in cooking, that sort of thing. And then we want to avoid the Pavlovian model of multiple choice. You've probably seen these things where they'll show you like a junior high entrance exam from 100 years ago, and you can't pass it with a graduate degree. Not just because the measurement units are arcane, but because back then almost all teaching was done in essay form. And it was when Pavlovian and Thomas Dewey and so forth decided we need to make things more reactive and treated people more in sort of an animal manner, that we started losing the ability to teach creativity. So by getting away from this model, you have a bit more of a creative culture. By political, I don't mean in the Democrat, Republican, liberal, whatever. I'm talking about just in terms of structure. On Earth, of course, we have large populations and short communication delays and very extensive trade. In the solar system, we've gone from 1 second or less to minutes or hours. We may have something where if you are in command of a vessel, you are in command of the vessel. If you have a settlement, you may be in command of the settlement, or you may have sort of I call it the Battlestar Galactica model, if one person's in charge of the politics and the other person's in charge of the ship. On the other side, you have, from a structure, you have something more like a base or a settlement or something like that. You don't have this national structure per se, and you have much smaller populations. On a starship, you have a certain degree of independence, and you've taken that jump and you've taken yet another jump. So my point with a lot of this is if you aim for something, a target as small at the center of a bullseye of designing a starship, it becomes much easier to design the concentric rings around that. Well, if you can design something for a starship, something for an Oort cloud is much easier. If you can design for an Oort cloud, something for the outer solar system, and then something for the inner solar system. I don't intend to take this back to Earth because Earth is a global community of 6 billion people, not a settlement like this. So as I said, you've got local governments, you may have regional governments that are based less on planetary systems, but more on which orbit are you in. Something I came up with after writing this, and now that I'm doing the book version of this, is you may have, for example, in an asteroid belt, you may have both in our solar system or in the distant solar system, you may have the universities on the inner side of the belt, and they would eventually, because they are orbiting more quickly than the other ones, they would eventually pass all the other sections of civilization. So you may have like a 10-year period or whatever where you pass all the other groups, and then you may want to go back out to where you originally came from, or you may want to, well, that place back there was good. Let's fly over there and retire or go start our career or whatever. So you may have something where the inner asteroid belt is sort of the urban concept, and then the outer side is the more rural. Just because of the orbital momentum. You would have the same thing with the orbital momentum that you have with the river valley where the cities are and the mountains where the miners are, that sort of thing. Another thing with, again, if there's 100 people, having 99 lawyers to figure things out is probably not a good plan. As I say, more tech writers, fewer lawyers. We want to know how to do things, not be micromanaged in how they need to be done specifically or legally or whatever. So what I would do is I have a core of the law. The other thing is this is sort of a reaction to what's going on now with, okay, here's your bill for whatever thing and nobody's ever going to read this. When you have regulation like that, you sort of have a tyranny of the apparatchik. You don't have people actually working on things, or you have to do it. Nobody can comprehend it. And if you have a very small population and you have a very large body of law, you're never going to get anything done. So what I would have is a core law that everybody knows and everybody is taught in school of roughly 1,000 pages. When you get into a subfield like business law, you'd still have another 1,000 pages. Still a manageable thing, 2-year textbook. And then once you start getting into a specific thing, in this case, say credit union regulation, then you start scoping it down like a tree. And the idea there is that if you add one law, you better take away another, or you better scope them together, because you want to try and keep things comprehensive. So in terms of economic models, this is one that was, it started gaining momentum around 1900. It sort of died out a little bit after 1945. And the reason it died out was because when we went from the industrialization of warfare with World War II, we started going to the industrialization of agriculture and things like that. So a lot of these ideas of sort of the Jeffersonian model of the gentleman farmer with the small isolated communities failed because the economy of scale drowned it out. But when you're down to a population, again, of 200, 300 people, it's time to revisit the idea of how do you make something with 200, 300 people work. So the idea here is that you embrace distributionism, or distributism was roughly in this time period. G.K. Chesterton was an advocate of this. He said, unbridled capitalism doesn't produce too many capitalists, but too few. We see this issue, the whole too big to fail. This is not a new idea. The family unit was the core economic unit. Small businesses were individually owned or owned by families. And I'm just describing this as it was. So you don't have banks, you have credit unions, you don't have labor unions, you have training guilds. You don't have investor owned, in other words, the stockbroker who knows absolutely nothing about your company is deciding what everything is. You have employee owned companies for larger scale operations. You don't have the economy of scale, but you do have distributed manufacture with the maker movement and 3D printing and so forth. This has a little bit more guts to it. And then you don't have a middle class that is exploited by status or by oligarchy in terms of the left or right. You have a stabilized middle class in a situation like this. And then going on to the other part of this, division and partnership. And I borrowed these terms from, I originally found this concept in Dante's Purgatorio, written in around 1300. He basically said, he was describing in Purgatory, he's basically going through the steps to go to heaven. And he's talking to this angel, and he says, so what is meant by division and partnership? How can one share good make a greater number than the possessors richer than if it is owned by a few? So because you fix your eyes, again, only on earthly things, the more people have of love truly, there's love. Basically what he's saying is this, if I put it into more genetic terms. There are certain things that are material, money can be split, knowledge can be copied. Property can be divided, but integrity can be modeled. In division, if there's a resource, whoever owns that resource is the one that benefits from that resource. But in partnership, because it is a non-material good, a non-material element, if it's knowledge or love or whatever in the case of that story, then all can benefit from it. So you have proprietary versus open source, represented as money, represented as virtue or knowledge. And we do need material goods to survive. We are material beings. We need food. But we also need these things to be great. We need these to grow intellectually, to grow mentally, and to grow in whatever virtue. So I kind of arranged this into a periodic table of economics, again, from the perspective of the space settlement. So we start with things, we get to, these are the raw elements. What are the structures that use those elements? Who are the people who use those elements? AP is automation percentage. In other words, in a technological civilization, what percentage of the exploitation of this to get it from this level to this level, from raw material asteroids or whatever to raw materials, how much of that can be automated theoretically? 10 minutes, okay. And then what is the database for this? So if it's asteroids, it's astronomy, and then eventually geology, or in the case of Mars, geology. So we go from raw materials and explorers to mining technology, industrial design, refined goods, and so forth. So this breaks down pretty much like a periodic table and so Then at the bottom here in that, table of noble gases or whatever, we have the, the arts and sciences and so forth, and education and medicine, other things you need that are in that soft skill area. And you notice all these are in blue that are the things of non-material, and all the things in black are the material side of the economic spectrum. So again, now we're getting into issues that are more specific to the starship thing. Do we want to break for questions, or do we want to talk about starships for 5 minutes? Okay. We don't know if quantum entanglement is going to be developed in a reliable way before we have a starship, because they're both pretty much out there. So this may be a game changer, but it would be a very slow baud rate situation. So you may be able to say, okay, my starship arrived and I'm safe. What you may have is, let's say you have 40 quantum entangled bits and they're destroyed when you use them. So you may have some sort of semaphore system where I unentangle one and it says I've got an issue. If I unentangle number 2, it says I'm fine. So I arrive, I unentangle number 2. Well, now I don't need to unentangle number 1, so I can change what that means on the table. So you can have a table of things where you're sending very quick messages back, but they're just the equivalent to this. They're not sending back a lot of live data. Whereas, meanwhile, you've got light speed, which would be limiting in terms of that sort of thing. So,
I think you can use 2, then the time difference between the last one and the next one can give a lot more information.
That's true. Yeah, and actually there was, somebody's using that. I think it's the laser communication on planetary resources or somebody. Somebody's using the time, they're doing that exact thing.
It's called pulse position modulation.
Oh, okay, so. But what's going to be interesting from a starship perspective is that if a starship goes the other way, you're always going to see them. Let's say you go 5 light years this way and they go 5 light years that way. That one is always going to look 10 years behind, even though they're in exactly the same place as you are. So you're going to see this weird thing where things are going to look increasingly Amish the further away you go, if it weren't for quantum communication saying, hey, oh, by the way, we invented a warp drive or something. What happens when the next starship arrives is another, a lot of this paper is about what disrupts things, and this is generally an issue with any kind of immigrant. And in this case, it's not the next ship from Ireland after the ship from Italy arrived in New York. In this case, we're talking about the first wave would be the Native Americans, and the next wave would be the next wave of Native Americans, and then the Vikings. We're talking about very large gaps. So we're talking about entire cultures that would be potentially disrupted by this sort of thing. So you'd have to have a cultural mechanism to deal with that sort of shock. And then in the case of a Mars thing, it would be separated not by, decades or centuries, but by years. So a little more compressed, but same sort of thing. Any questions? We have got, how many minutes?
You got 6 minutes.
Okay.
It would seem that just as we're testing physical habitations, it would be good to set this up and test it. I suppose we're testing bits and pieces now. Is that something that this could, 300 people maybe could sustain themselves in a test mode here? Not now, but maybe in 20 years or.
I think we're going to kind of go towards that, and I think that Mars One is sort of a concept for that. But if it's not Mars One, it's going to be something else someday. So what I'm trying to say is, okay, we have to unthink the whole globalism that we've been indoctrinated with since 1945, and start thinking about it in different terms that are a bit more, for lack of a better word, hunter-gatherer and less industrial. But at the same time, we have to remember the fact that we have 3D printers.
So in the future, there's like 3D printers, and it's very likely that we'll also have like robotic servants with us to help us with a myriad of things, as well as education and things. How do you see people maintaining a certain lifestyle that we would see as being like humane? I don't see how that would like.
If we're raised by robots, we're going to start acting like robots.
Well, yeah, we'll have. Well, there'll be the bureaucracy will be so instilled because of the way the system will have been set up. Because you're not going to have people just saying, oh, let's go do this. It'll be some government or
You're,
some.
you're kind of coming back to my central point, which is that a lot of what we've forgotten to do today is we've learned how to do technology, but we haven't learned how to think. And we haven't learned how to create. And a lot of things have become more derivative of previous things and so forth.
What do you mean by your distributive system? Does that mean the total production of the entire colony then is going to be distributed equally among everybody?
This is just the name they gave it, so I wish I had a better name because it does, nowadays it sounds like a communist arrangement. In reality, it was a middle ground between, it was trying to avoid the state owning everything or the oligarchy owning everything. It was like, no, let's have the people who actually do the work own the material, not have somebody, you know, in Moscow or whatever saying that the people own it and actually, you know, having a DACA over in Cock, you know, so.
Because, you know, there has been an experiment where everything was divided equally, and this was the approach that the Pilgrims
Yeah.
used, and as a result, the Indians had to feed them because they were all starving, and that system basically didn't work.
Yeah, this is much more, this goes back to what I said about knowledge. When you have a finite, Zubrin's book, Merchants of Despair, does a really good job of tearing down the whole issue of if you treat things like a closed system, nobody's going to invent anything. And that's been the historical thing. What I'm saying is that if you actually are on a starship, you really do have a closed system. But the salvation of that closed system is you better be able to think, because you want to be able to have the same resources work with a larger population, because there are no new resources coming from somewhere else.
Just one slight correction. Everybody didn't own things equally. Adult males owned things. See, I make this over and over because half the human population, the adults, are automatically left out and no one even notices it. And this skews models. If we're looking to them for a model of today's society, that's not it.
I think you need to take the lessons where you take the lessons, and you adjust the numbers where you adjust the numbers.
Yes, but people don't bother. I mean, when I teach, I used to hear this, ancient Athens had a true democracy. Ah, really? Only adult male citizens.
If I may, the older I get, the more I realize that the things I learned in school, the real answer is it's more complicated than that. Yeah.
So given the importance of genetic diversity, in your example, why did you choose to leave with 100 and arrive with 250 rather than leave with 250?
It was just a generic number to pull up to basically say, okay, can I build this is for a starship. Okay, so it was just, okay, if we start with 100, it's a nice round number that you can comprehend. I believe there was a study, and this is the reason I did not quote it, because saying I believe there's a study because I saw something 20 years ago is not evidence. So I did not put it in the paper, I just put that in as an arbitrary number, is that I think it's around 84 people you need to maintain a genetic, to avoid inbreeding. But because I don't have the source of that number, I'm not going to, this is, like I said, it's a straw man for a reason. You know, this is a starting point for, okay, let's discuss this.
What was the number?
100 people leaving, 250 on arrival, in other words, having children en route.
Yeah, in 2 generations.
Yeah. Yes?
Why is the basic unit a family instead of an individual?
At some point you need, again, I'm describing distributism as it was known in the early 20th century. So I would like, there's a part of me that is very individualistic. My family is me right now. I'm divorced. I have no kids. I have a cat. And she doesn't do much. So consequently, my economic unit, my family, is me. I don't even have parents at this point. So that said, that's my individual take. Again, it's a question of if your family is you, then your family is you. If your family is you and a wife and kids and all that, then that is your core unit that you are, trying to bring about. That has a certain immortality to it that an individual doesn't.
Okay.
Perhaps.
are now.
Yeah,
I mean,
probably not in my
There's
case.
nothing to say that mortality is necessary. I mean, you know, that's, I guess my problem with it, because over time, a family unit could become a very, very large thing, and as with anything human, when you have different individuals interacting in one system, there are going to be disagreements and people are going to want out. And if you don't allow them to get out, you are essentially coercive. There is no peaceful way to do that. You have to force them, and that is immoral.
Families typically don't work that way. If you make your family go
That's
off to a different
true.
area.
For
Now, there is,
well-adjusted families, but for families that are not so well adjusted, where there's some serious problems and people want out, to say that there is a legal authority there, I don't really understand what that would accomplish.
well, we're not having a, when I say the family isn't as a basic economic, that is not necessarily the basic political unit. The political model here was the idea of let's just limit the regulation to something that people can comprehend and embody. So in that situation, what you're basically saying is there ought to be something in there that says, okay, I am going to start a new division. And in the case of, say, asteroid settlement, you are eventually, again, this is hard because we're looking at this with one eye. My other paper last year was the hardware side of it, and that was basically the idea that you could have an asteroid settlement that would dock onto an asteroid, gradually double in population, double in size, split, have a mitosis, and half the population would go somewhere else. So you actually do have that split going on continually in a settlement situation where you have essentially it's actually very analogous to the migrant, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah. Well, and this is routine with nomadic. That's the word.
Genetic concentration is too high.
And that's actually, and again, when I do the book version of this, it'll
We
split
have
up.
time for one more question.
One more question? Okay. Yes.
I was brought up by two physicists who knew all of the people who did all of quantum. So I'll just say, I mean, depending on quantum entanglement, I wouldn't put any eggs in that basket because quantum physics itself will kind of tell you it's only a probability that it works. It's got two other possibilities. It's either likely to be much stranger than we ever thought, or it doesn't work at all.
Yeah.
When you get
As I
in
said,
there for it.
these are disruptions, not things in the plan.
Oh, okay.
So.
When we have